Laura Gale is a multi-best-selling ghostwriter and editor of business books and co-host of the Business of Writing podcast. She helps business leaders stand out and grow with the help of a book. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Laura, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Charlie.
So before we got started, and I have all sorts of questions about living all over the world, and I think there's some truths about ghostwriting that we'll get into that are related to travel. You grew up with a like motto around sunblock going to school in Australia, slip, slap.
Slip, slap, slap. It's slip on a t-shirt, slap on a hat, slap on some sunscreen. And this was kind of the ubiquitous health campaign throughout my entire childhood. The other one was no hat, no play. So didn't bring your hat to school, you were sidelined.
Wow.
They're very serious about it.
It is just because of the UV intensity in Australia.
Yeah, the sun is just so strong and it affects kids disproportionately. So they're just very, very proactive about it.
Wild.
But the motto stay with you for life. So my toddler, no hat, no play.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, and I feel as though, because now you're in the UK and much like Ireland, it's kind of the opposite. There's like vitamin D deficiency and all those. Probably don't have to worry about that in Australia.
Not so much, yeah.
But yeah, you had mentioned when we were setting this up that one thing you wanted to talk about was that experience of living all over the world, growing up in a different culture than where you're from. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I mean, first of all, I guess, where have you lived and traveled?
Oh, the list of traveled is pretty long, but I left Australia in 2013 because I wanted to sort of start my own business. And growing up in Sydney, I just felt like it was a very expensive place to do that. And so I decided I'd kind of get on the road and experiment with a few different places. So I went to Thailand and Vietnam first. I was there for about 2 years, kind of going back and forth between the two. I went to Austin for a year to do some consulting with a startup there. I went to Germany for a while, hung out there for several months, which was awesome. I really loved it there. And then ended up in Lisbon for 6 years, which is a beautiful city and so much interesting stuff going on there. And then, after COVID, my husband and I decided it was time for a new start. He's British, so we decided that it would be the UK. So maybe one day back to Australia, but for the time being here in Bath. And I've traveled all over the place. I've been to Colombia and I've been to Fiji and all over. I mean, the north of the UK as well. There's heaps of places, France and Italy and Spain. So lots and lots of travel. Just find it a super interesting way to spend some time. There's just so much to learn from how other people do life and see the world and set up their societies. So I think it's kind of a never ending source of interest there.
I think if there's one thing you can take away from the experience of seeing a lot of different places, it's that like there are a huge variety of ways to, like you said, set up your life and live. And I think it's really, there are a lot of downsides to staying in one place. But to me, one of the most unfortunate ones is that you sort of assume that the way you live is like the only possible way, when just logically doesn't even make sense when you consider life going on in all these other places. And were you like a digital nomad the whole time? What were you doing in Vietnam and Thailand?
Yeah, I mean, I was based in a specific place in both of those. So in Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand and in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Just got like long-term apartments there. I like to travel, but not like every week. That is not conducive to getting a lot of writing done. So it was enough to kind of be in one place for several months at a time. It also kind of meant you got settled into a good routine. You found the good coffee shop and, the good place to go for lunch. And like, you can kind of set your life up pretty quickly if you're not constantly on the move. A lot of people that I knew were traveling a lot more than that, but I thrive on routine and writing responds very well to routine, as I'm sure you know. And so, I definitely went at a slower pace than a lot of people did. And I felt really rewarded by that because I also got to meet more people and kind of build better relationships. And I think have a more immersive experience than just what you get kind of what you can manage in a couple of days in a new place.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great way to travel where you can essentially get like a new hometown almost after a while.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm wondering, like, and did you grow up traveling? And was that something where you just
Not really. I mean, I'm
took
one of
off?
4 kids, and my mum was a full-time parent. So for a family that size to do a lot of travel was not super practical all the time. But we did start traveling a bit more when I was in my teens and everybody was kind of a bit more capable. So yeah, my parents now are avid travelers. They're going to come for Christmas and we're going to go to Norway middle of
Ooh.
January. So wish me luck. But yeah, I think Australia generally has a pretty strong travel culture. You know, it's very common for people to go to Bali or Thailand, Cambodia, kind of those Southeast Asian countries, just because even though they sound far away for most people and they are still sort of an 8-hour, 10-hour flight from most of Australia, it's close enough that people can kind of go for a week. But yeah, it's very common to travel there and it's a very diverse place to grow up as well. You know, about 50% of my high school were kids from other cultures. And so there was a lot of, I think, overlapping kind of how people experienced the world. You know, it did not seem weird to me to think about going to Sri Lanka or to Cambodia or any of those places because I knew heaps of people from those places. So yeah, I think it definitely kind of set me up early to think of it as something valuable.
Mm. And I guess as far as when you look at how it might have set you up for the rest of your life, do you think that kind of multicultural experience and then the travel that followed shaped kind of why you're a writer and especially if, with things like ghostwriting where you're really stepping into other voices?
I mean, I had kind of always been on a trajectory to end up in something writing adjacent, at least. Um, total bookworm as a kid, did a writing and publishing degree, and then worked in one of the sort of big 5 publishing houses straight out of university for several years. So had kind of been in the book world from the get-go. But I do think that starting my own business and traveling kind of accelerated the path to ghostwriting. I don't think I would have come to it anywhere near as quickly, if at all, if I had stayed in the traditional publishing world. I think you have to experiment a lot more when you're out on your own, when you're responsible for bringing in your own income. You test a lot of things and figure out what works. And yeah, after doing quite a bit of content marketing, somebody asked me to write a book for them. I had just arrived in Portugal by that point, and it kind of just snowballed very quickly. I think having been on location with a lot of people who were potential clients, all over the world, having spent that year in the US, I kind of understood how American clients wanted to do business. I don't think I would have had all that context and kind of the nuance that made it possible for me to get lots of clients early on had I not had that more global experience. It's just so important to understand the context that people are coming from.
Mm.
I think, Australia is, in terms of sort of a media industry or a creative industry, definitely just much smaller than other places just because the population is so much smaller. And so having spent some time in much, much bigger markets, it really helped me understand kind of who I was competing with, what the deliverables were expected to be, and kind of how people wanted to conduct those relationships that I just wouldn't have had otherwise.
Mm. It's interesting that it's almost a professional version of what you were saying of there being different ways to approach life, that
Definitely.
business is that way too.
Yeah.
Um, I I find that I kind of get these weird moments of reverse culture shock when I'm on calls with Americans who want to get straight to business and there's a
Yeah.
little bit less banter. But it's, I think in a lot of ways, everything is figure outable,
Mm.
where once you understand that context that you're describing, then that can explain a whole host of other things about that relationship.
Totally. And I think having, again, that travel experience makes you realize that everything is figure outable because you just see people making it work in so many situations. I would think a family of 5 would not fit on a single moped with their pig, but they do. So,
With their pig.
a number of times I've seen this, or, like carrying an enormous pane of glass on a motorbike, or like people just like needs must, right? And people figure it out. People are so ingenious. They're so creative. And so I think seeing, even just the very like mundane day-to-day stuff can seem completely incredible if it's so different to what you're used to. And so I think it does make you more aware that this, business problem in front of you, like there's more than one way to answer this email or to respond to this problem, or, go for a walk, see what's happening outside, and maybe you'll come back with some ideas.
Mm. Yeah, I would want to take a trip right now. I mean, which is, I think, a common reaction to Ireland in the winter.
Fair.
But talk about like a totally different culture and way of doing things. You have a background in traditional publishing, like you mentioned, and I feel as though that is such a, even though it's the goal for a lot of people to work with a traditional publisher, I feel like that world is really mysterious and intimidating. So I guess first, like, what were you doing there, and then what did you kind of learn from that time?
So I was really fortunate in my final year of university. One of the requirements was that you did an internship somewhere within the industry. And a friend of a friend had recently gotten a job as a junior at this publishing house. And she was like, oh, yeah, we need an intern. Like, would you want to come? So I went for a day a week for a year. And, people always say, oh, don't do free labor. That was like the best use I possibly could have made of that time. My time at that point was not very valuable. And so being there every week, seeing campaigns developing and the way they approached the business was just incredibly educative. But also it meant that one day when I turned up and my boss had quit on the spot and walked out, they were like, we need a publicist. Would you like to be a publicist? So I was there and they had a need, and I was kind of already plugged into their process. So bit of a right place, right time situation. But I ended up working as a publicist there for several years. And I mean, it's a huge company, right? It has many, many imprints. And so I was working across literary fiction, science fiction, young adult fiction, memoir, business books. There was heaps of different stuff going on. And I got to spend time with authors who wrote across all of those different genres and promote them. And so, because there's so much variety there, you've also got to be quite creative and diverse in how you think about building campaigns, what kind of messaging is going to land for different markets. You just get a really intuitive sense of kind of how to get a book to seem compelling to the right audience. So that was extremely, extremely valuable. It also taught me how to handle a volume of work that maybe a different role would not have. So it comes as a shock to a lot of people to know that every publicist in every publishing house usually has 20 or 30 books that they're responsible for every single month. So there's a lot of promotional stuff going up and down. And that's kind of one of the key lessons as well. Authors really need to be involved in the marketing of their own book. Even if they have a traditional publisher, there's so much competition. And even, among the team whose job it is to represent your book, it's just one of many that they've got to make work. And, the traditional publishing model has forever kind of followed that, what we now think of as the Silicon Valley model, where one big winner pays for dozens of smaller experiments. And so if you don't want your book to be the small experiment that isn't that big hitter, you've got to be really invested in the process of promoting it. So these days, I always tell clients, like, writing is 50% of the job. And I'm so sorry because that seems so awful, but 50% remaining is marketing, getting your book in front of the right people, promoting it. That's how you build a sustainable career as an author, because if the first book doesn't sell, there's no sales record to make it compelling to a publisher for a second book. So it's really, really important to think about that marketing process. And even if you are self-publishing, I mean, definitely if you go self-publishing, it's doubly important, really, because then you are solely responsible for the marketing. It's not a build it and they will come kind of scenario with books. There are something like 2 million books published every year. So you've got to, again, understand this going in so that you can build a plan and kind of tackle it throughout the process. If you wait until launch day to start telling people your book exists, you've lost so much time and potential. So probably the most important lesson I learned from publishing was just marketing is everything. It's amazing to get to the stage of having written your whole book and be at the point of publication, but people can't buy what they don't know about, and you've got to help them find out. So that was the big one. But then also just understanding the mechanics of the industry was so interesting, because there's so much that goes into getting a book traditionally published. The processes are long. There are many, many people involved, many steps involved. And so now I can kind of advise people which publishing route is going to be best for them, because I understand both worlds. I've done a lot of self-publishing. I've done the traditional publishing thing. And so it's much easier for me now to say, based on your goals, I think this or that direction is going to be better. So yeah, it's very much an advantage to have the mysterious elements kind of stripped away, to know what the inner workings look like. It just, yeah, I mean, it's like any industry, right? Like there's lots of standards and lots of processes that everybody follows, but to an outsider, it just looks like something magic is happening and then a book comes out the other end.
Sure. And that's something that has come up on here before. We've had a couple of publicists on, and that was kind of their thing, is like, don't be that person who says, I've written a book. Now how do I market? Or sorry, no, my book came out last week. How do I market it? It's like 2 years ago was the answer.
Yeah.
And going back to kind of that, which publishing platform or kind of path is right for you in your book. One thing that has come up again and again on this podcast and elsewhere is people talking about the majority of cases where probably hybrid or self-publishing is the way to go. And I don't think enough airtime is actually given to books that are sort of perfect for traditional publishing, which some definitely are. Like, I'm coming off of getting into a couple of projects right now that we're going that way. We're doing proposals. I've finished one that's coming out next year. And next year is now, according to when this is probably coming out. But yeah, what would make you say, hang on, let's not dive right into the whole manuscript, because what you have here is probably and I'm talking nonfiction, because I know for fiction it's different, but what would make you sort of pump the brakes and say, let's really think about doing a proposal and taking this to a traditional publisher or an agent?
So I think one is where the author already has a really big audience and the material is going to have broad appeal. So this is why a lot of self-help books do really well. Mark Manson's book that is kind of this super famous example now of the subtle art of not giving a beep. Broad appeal of that book, and the combination of that with him having such a big audience just makes that a no-brainer for a publisher. There's a ready set of buyers, and it's going to do really well even with people who are outside that audience, because it's immediately applicable. The concept is really clear. I think what a lot of publishers want is just a premise that is instantly recognizable. And I think this is where a lot of, especially first-time nonfiction writers, struggle, is getting clarity around what that central message is and what the promise is that they're making to their reader. Everybody kind of wants to include a bit of everything because it's hard to whittle down. It's painful to pick a central premise and just stick with it. But that focus, I think, is really critical. I think where there is any kind of public awareness of the topic that you're talking about, so I know that you've recently worked on a book about 9/11 first responders. Everybody in the world knows about 9/11, right? And how incredible those people were. So there's mass appeal there. There's immediate relatability for a huge, huge number of people. It's a lot of books perform really well when there is that kind of, I guess, like group ownership of a concept. Everybody has a little piece of 9/11. Like, everybody remembers where they were. Everybody remembers kind of the fallout. So everyone can kind of immediately be like, oh yeah, that book would be interesting. Obviously, where there is like a huge personal transformation where there's kind of any interaction with famous people. Everybody loves famous people. Memoirs are rich territory for a lot of publishers. But I would say also one thing people need to think about is wherever there's controversy in your book, a little bit of legal cover can go a long way. And a traditional publisher is really important for that sort of thing. So I've had this conversation with a couple of clients recently, one who is writing an investigative journalism piece about corruption in a very lucrative industry, and another one who is writing kind of an expose from the inside of a very, very famous company that you have definitely heard of. I was like,
Awesome.
you are going to get absolutely crushed by these legal teams if you publish this by yourself. Like, they will come knocking at your door and you will be broke for the rest of your life. So I think wherever there is kind of the potential for legal action as a result of the book, having a traditional publisher is really important because they have the infrastructure to protect you and to protect the book, but they also kind of have the leverage to turn that legal action into publicity and kind of a reverse pressure. And that's always going to be good for the book. That kind of interest, oh, so-and-so is suing you, must be because you've got something interesting to say. And so there's a lot of leverage in that kind of partnership when there's something controversial. I mean, we could talk all day about what makes an appealing book to publishers.
No, I mean, that's such a good point. And also I think the legitimacy, because
Totally.
if you're going to do an expose on a corrupt company, you're so easy to dismiss if you're just self-publishing. Like I know there are some publishers, there's one that comes to mind where they platform a lot of really kooky conspiracy nonsense. But anyone who knows the publishing industry knows that you only need to say who published this to essentially write the book off. And again, it's just like how there's some stories that belong in the Atlantic. They aren't just to be tweeted by some. I often think of that thing Hunter Thompson said of like citizen journalists or like citizen dentists. Like, like why would you even go there?
Yeah, exactly.
There are a couple things there that I want to come back to. When you say a big following, how big is big? I think people might be, because one thing that has come up on a previous episode is people have no idea what it takes to write a bestseller. And I think most people, if you ask them, would say like 1 million copies or 10 million, or when in reality it could be as little as like 2,000.
Yeah, for context, most books never sell more than 2,000 copies in their entire lifetime. So the bar is relatively low. If you sold 10,000 copies of your book, that would be a very respectable sell through. And most publishers would be like, yeah, that's a good mid-list author. They're not going to be our like big marquee event, but they're going to make back their advance. They're going to make a bit more money. Like, we'll do that again. And that kind of book does contribute a lot to the bottom line of a publisher. And so, they'll be very happy if you write one of those books every couple of years. That works well for everybody, right? So 10,000 copies is a great, especially for a first time publication, like that's good. I think in terms of audience size, like it's one of those like how long is a piece of string questions. For some publishers, they'll be really happy to see an email list of 5,000 people. Others will want to see, a combined social media audience of 500,000. It really depends on what the topic of the book is, what the expected sell-through of the book is. If they have kind of bought the book with a small advance and an expectation that they'll do a print run of, say, 2,000 copies up front, that's very achievable with a small audience, right? Like, and by small, I mean, a few thousand people. You could definitely get enough pre-orders kind of set up before the book comes up with, a concerted marketing campaign, and then, obviously do a bunch of marketing afterwards, as we've discussed. You could easily sell through 2,000 copies with a clear campaign with an audience of that size. I think if you're looking to sell 1 million copies, realistically, you have to have an audience that's at least that big.
Sure.
Because not everybody is going to buy. And I think that's kind of the other thing. It doesn't guarantee that just having an audience isn't necessarily enough to sell the book. It's got to be the right audience and an engaged audience as well. So I think, of course, most books will kind of start to generate their own momentum after a time. If you sold 100,000 copies already, there's going to be a lot of media coverage. There's going to be a lot of buzz about it on social media and in various places. So it will start to kind of create its own little ecosystem. But yeah, to begin with, you definitely need to be able to put it out to a high volume of people if you want that kind of big result.
And as far as what that looks like from the business of speculating on these trends and platforms and stuff like that, one thing that I've seen a little bit of from kind of the other side of the table is when, and this reminds me of like kind of classic Hollywood or even Silicon Valley, where like, what's that old saying of like, nobody like knows anything. And I get the impression that something will be kind of like, for instance, Book Talk recently. It was this thing where it was almost synonymous. It was like, especially with fiction, it seemed like it was almost necessary to have sort of TikTok fame anticipate your book deal. But then I get the impression that some of those books haven't done as well as publishers had hoped. And so like I've heard grumblings of late that they're sort of backtracking a little bit on how much emphasis they're putting on platform and when looking at proposals. I mean, there's a question in there somewhere, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, that's a thing, right?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, publishers are ultimately making educated guesses, right? And we've seen this so many times, right? Like we see it in TV shows, we see it in, like the studios that make a lot of podcasts and stuff. Like they're always experimenting with new shows, new formats, and it's the same in books. Once you've been in the industry for a while, you start to think, yeah, that one's going to hit, or that one needs a little bit of tweaking before it's going to be viable. But your best guess is still a guess. And just because something has done really well once before doesn't mean that an equivalent book is necessarily going to do as well. And, there have been many instances where publishers have made a huge investment and it's just gone nowhere, it just sinks, or it completely blows up in their face for some reason, or they spend like no money on a book on some unknown and it just goes absolutely nuts. Like it can go both ways, and both ways it takes people by surprise. There's often, when something suddenly blows up, there's always this mad scramble to get more copies because you instantly sell through all of your print run, and then you've got to like wait for printers and shipping and all of the stuff. And so, it creates its own kind of little cycle of problems. But it is a gambling industry, essentially. There's a lot more control over what you might see in a casino, but, people are guessing. There's a lot of numbers that go into the guesses. There's a lot of prediction that goes into the guesses as well. And so, the best you can do is make a strong case for your book. And I always tell people to think of their book proposals as a business case. If you're going to find an investor for a business, you would write up some market analysis. You would talk to them about the kind of returns they could expect to see, what you were going to do to make this work. And a book proposal is very much the same thing, right? Talk about similar titles and how well they sold. Talk about, the hooks that worked in comparable titles and why yours is kind of touching on a similar pain point in the audience. Talk about what your plan is to do them, to help with the marketing. There's a lot you can kind of put to a publisher to say, I am a safe bet. It's not just the book. They're also buying into you. And, publication is just a very collaborative process. You're going to be involved in a lot of that, a lot of the decision making, obviously all of the publicity. You need to be as much a safe bet for them as the book itself. And so a book proposal is kind of your opportunity to show, like, I'm thinking critically about this process. I'm not taking this for granted. I'm not entitled. I'm expecting that I'm going to do some of the heavy lifting alongside you. It's going to at least make you stand out a little bit more that you've done your research and that you know what you're talking about.
It's also like, it's funny you say that too about like kind of showing that you've done your homework. It's sort of your first chance to show them that that you're normal.
Yes.
One of the first pieces, it's crazy this, and for anyone listening at home, Laura's just giving me this look of like recognition. The first time I was having like meetings around a book, I was talking to a friend who's an editor, like in-house at a big 5 publisher. And she wasn't actually even involved in this. She was just giving me advice, and we met up to have lunch. And I said, I get, like, I'm starting to get a feeling based on these meetings that if you're just sort of like decent and polite, that's like an anomaly.
It's
And
wild.
she kind of got quiet and just like nodded, like knowingly. I mean, that sounds
It sounds
crazy,
crazy,
especially
right?
like yeah, I mean, we live in a day and age where you kind of, it's hard to keep it a secret if you're a jerk, but that's a thing too, that like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a funny thing in the publishing world that once people start getting that kind of attention where maybe there's a book deal in the mix, people get ahead of themselves, right? They start thinking, I've made it, I'm amazing, I am, one of the very chosen few. And so I think entitlement can kind of sneak in very quickly. The deal is not done until the money is in the bank. It's on you to make sure you get all the way through that process, because there's no obligation from the publisher to publish you. Be on time. That's a simple one. Respond to emails in a timely way, show up looking like you've showered and, got yourself ready. Like the number of times I would, and, by this time, obviously being published, they were kind of a little bit further into the process, but the authors who made it easy for me to work with them just kind of automatically got more of my attention and my energy, and I would love to say that I was perfectly fair to everybody, but the authors who were, very disagreeable and who didn't respond to me and who, were disorganized or late or didn't show up when we were on stage at a festival or, and I had to go knocking on their hotel rooms, like that doesn't make me want to help you. I think if you get to that stage where you're working with a publisher, and like this is a minority, right? Like most people are very cooperative, very keen to help, very, they really want to make the book work. And most people do want to be helpful and liked and someone that the team wants to engage with. Like most people want that. And so I think the advice is mostly like just bring that energy, don't kind of get in your own head or start believing your own hype.
Yeah, that sounds like good advice for
I'll leave
everyone,
it there.
everywhere. Yeah, seriously, full stop. Now, you mentioned when you talk about your own start as a ghostwriter, and I apologize if you want to talk more about
It's okay.
ghostwriting in your own work, but this was such an interesting little side quest. It sounds like your experience sounds a lot like mine and a lot like almost everyone I've talked to who's a ghostwriter, which is that you were doing another kind of writing professionally.
Yeah.
And then you were sort of tapped to write a book. What would be your advice? Like, let's say I came to you and I was in the exact same position and I'm freaking out because I remember how that felt, and I don't know how it was for you, but for me, it was like I was routinely writing enough to get a book done in the time I had to write it. It wasn't a question of like, can I write every day or is my writing good enough to get paid? Like those, I already answered both those questions with like, I was writing professionally, but there was something about like, can I write a whole book from cover to cover? What would be your advice to someone who's right in that and that transition or that kind of like turning point in their
Yeah,
career?
it's a great question because I think we have kind of culturally, we still really like venerate books, right? Even though there are so many of them out there, like people who write books are in some way special. And so it's kind of crossing a psychological Rubicon, I think, to become the kind of person that writes books. And so it's a little bit about updating your own identity to say, no, actually, I do have the capacity to do this. I've probably already written a book's worth of content or, much more in my previous work. But I think the thing that really helped me at that point, I had been running my own little like freelance business for 4 years. And some of the best advice I had ever gotten was to treat business like a game. Can you charge 20% more on every client call? Can you push the boat out a little bit further on what you promised to deliver? Can just do experiments, treat it like a game. And if you fail, then okay, you learn something. It's not, I think most writers are pretty perfectionist, A-type by nature. And so there's a lot of tendency to obsess over getting it perfectly right. from the very first step. There's no way of being perfectly right. And so I think just letting go of that expectation of yourself is important. But I said to that client, I have a lot of experience writing. I have all of this publishing background. I've never written a whole book before. So if I would like to treat this as an experiment, and if you are comfortable with that, then we have a deal. And he said, yeah, fine. And, I work a lot with business owners and entrepreneurs, and so they're used to a level of risk. I think probably there are a number of clients who would be a little bit more hesitant about that proposal. But I think, I also charged him at a rate that, that was less than I could have charged him, because I knew I was going to have a lot to learn in that process. And so I sort of figured that if I keep the stakes relatively low for him and the pressure relatively low for me, then both of us stand to win. And that worked really well, because I felt like I was absolutely going to be able to deliver something well beyond the value that he paid me. And so I felt confident, like I wasn't stressing myself out at 3 a.m. being like, is this guy going to want all his money back? He, I think, felt like, well, if it doesn't work out, I didn't pay very much. And so it might be, to some people that might sound really like a negative framing, but I knew I could deliver something good. And so when the book was finished, he was thrilled with it. And he went around telling people about me for months afterwards. And I got several clients off the back of that recommendation. So even though it sounds like selling yourself low or kind of undervaluing yourself, and it sounds like I was very strategic about it, at the time, but I think, this is kind of hindsight being 2020, that mix of keeping the pressure and the stakes low helped a lot to mean that the book was as good as it could possibly be, and that he was really happy, and then went off and told lots of people about it.
That makes a lot of sense too, when you think of it as, because I think a lot of resistance and writer's block and stuff is almost a form of like stage fright or like
Yes,
performance
definitely.
anxiety, where,
yeah.
And by taking that pressure off, then you're able to do the work, I guess, because you're not.
Yeah. Like if I was charging then what I charge now, I would have been completely paralyzed. Like I don't know if this is good enough to charge that kind of money. Like now I know, okay, if they make 1 or 2 sales with their clients off the back of this book, they've paid for the whole thing. It's definitely worth it. That's the benefit of having now done many, many books and seeing that process over and over again. But I didn't know that at that time. And I didn't have the identity of somebody who could charge that much money, right? Like so much. I mean, we could get into like a whole money mindset thing here, but like so much of getting to the point where you can kind of confidently make a living writing books, you can't do it if you're charging pennies. Like the projects are too big, they are too immersive, they take too much from you to be charging what you charge for like blog content. Like it's just not the same. And so you do kind of have to become someone that can justify charging that much money. And there are a number of ways, I think, to do that. One is experience, just getting the reps in. One is learning a lot about a lot of different things so that you become a bit more of an advisor than just a writer. It's a book, like I said, is just such a collaborative project. If you can only handle the writing, but nothing else, you can't recommend a cover designer, you can't handle formatting, you can't do the uploads for self-publishing, or like you can't write a book proposal, you can't tell them how to find an agent. Like there are lots and lots of pieces in the mix. The more of those pieces you can do, the more you can charge, and the more you become an expert who can justify those kind of rates. So I think there's a lot of professional development that kind of goes into getting to that stage. But yeah, start where you're comfortable and where it's low stakes, and then work your way up to being that more advisor and kind of higher end.
God, I have so many thoughts there. I think it's funny too, how, so there are a couple of things that have come up along the way that I think people would be really surprised to learn. And one of them is that I think, and there's a word for this in economics, I forget how it's pronounced. It starts with a V, but like writing is almost is it a Veblen?
Oh gosh.
It's
I don't know.
There's a certain something good where it's basically it's a product where it's like people would rather pay more for it.
Yes.
Art is kind of the classic example. You wouldn't want to pay 9 million for a painting when you could pay 10 million.
Sure.
Or even maybe set the record for how much someone has paid. And I recently heard of a ghostwriter who like gets jobs because she's the $250,000 option.
Yeah.
And some business people, that's what they want to like.
Yeah.
They want to know who is that. They start with
who is that person?
like basically who's charging like
I mean, if you knew that you needed
to
win an NBA championship, you're just going to Michael Jordan, aren't you? Like that, there's just no other. And it's exactly the same thing, right? Like if you know you need to, produce a completely industry-changing gadget, Steve Jobs is the only choice, right? Like there's just these people that are super prolific and they're wildly expensive, but because they're wildly expensive, you know that they can back it up because you can't get away with charging that kind of thing if you can't deliver. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for finding a way to make yourself that person in your market.
And the weird paradox there that I've seen like firsthand is no one has ever hired me on the basis of education or credentials or past work or anything other than like a vibe check.
Yeah.
Which is, again, it might sound really counterintuitive given the stakes that you described, the cost, the time commitment. But also everything you're saying about like what you can bring to the table, knowing how these things are done and being able to point someone to a cover designer or a formatter or whatever, speaks to something I was told about at the end of a project when we wrapped, which is like that it felt good not to do it alone. And I don't know, it's one of those things. I guess that doesn't fit into really sleek like business advice, but I feel like that's oftentimes what will land you a project.
There is so much anxiety in this process for people. If they've decided that for whatever reason they're going to pursue this, it's a huge mystery. As we said earlier, it's a total black box. Like, where do you even start to get into this? But also there's so many unknowns. Most people don't know how to register a book for copyright protection. Most people don't know how to upload, to this like one very archaic form, in the back of Ingram Sparkle. And like, there's a million things that go into getting a book out and selling. Having somebody who knows those processes is key. But I think it's also, and this is, again, it's not sleek business advice, but the person themselves matters. If you have an affinity with that person, do you get along with them? Do you want to spend time with them? Because if you're like, oh, I have to go talk to that guy, you're not gonna do your best work, right? You're not gonna give them your best answers. You're not gonna get back to them promptly. Like, if there's drag in your personal relationship with your ghostwriter, I think it comes out in the book. And one of the best things ghostwriters can do is just to be themselves. And I know that sounds like generic, terrible, like mom advice, but it's true, because you're going to spend a lot of time with each other, right? Like at least 6 months, probably a year, sometimes more. It's key that you get along with them. It's key that you want to do work with them, and that you're going to be proud to have your name on something alongside theirs, and that they are going to be in your client list forever, and that, they're probably going to recommend you to other people. Like, do you want more people like that in your life? And, it's important stuff to think about. And so there are plenty of people that I've been like, for me, I'm going to send you to someone else. And that's fine. That protects my peace, as they say. And I think it's a hard thing to come at when you're self-employed or, working solo, to kind of turn down work. But honestly, it's one of the most important things you can learn how to do, because having that personal connection and feeling good about the people you're working with and about the material that you're working on is so crucial to keeping your energy up, keeping your motivation up, keeping you on task. And, I think you get more of what you accept in your life. And so you should only accept good things.
I was gonna say, yeah, there's so much stuff out there, and we've been there's an episode that hasn't happened yet that we've been meaning to put together, which is like about client red flags.
Yeah.
And we're gonna try to do it in a way where we're kind of anonymizing it,
Mm.
so it's not like there's pressure
Obvious.
to. Yeah. But I feel as though I've been so lucky. I've only ever worked with people I really am happy to work with, and I'm really kind of usually sad when we're
Yeah.
done talking every day.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, I mean, is that a case of respecting that spirit of collaboration that you're describing, where you really are looking for like, do I want to spend a year with this person? Do I want 10 more projects like this one?
Yeah. And again, most people are great, right? Like it's pretty rare, like in, however many, I've done like 30 plus projects now. I've turned down 3. So that's a good hit rate, right? Like that's not bad. I think it's just knowing what works for you. Like it comes down so much to knowing yourself, right? Like the type of behaviors that are difficult for you to cope with, or, stuff that you think like, wow, that rubbed me the wrong way and we're not working together yet. If you notice those things, like those are important to recognize. And, I think especially if it's material that you don't agree with, like, one of the things that I turned down was a guy who was like super anti like state funded healthcare and state funded education. And I was like, I actually really love those things. So this is going to not be good for me to write about. Like I'm the wrong person to help you with this. So, I think just knowing yourself and what you value is going to go a long way to being protective there.
I would have had turning that one down would have been the highlight of my day. I mean,
I did not feel bad about it.
I think I would have, even just hearing that someone wanted to write that book is upsetting, but I'd be like, well, it's lucky that no one listens to you, because I wouldn't be able to write this book if I hadn't gotten a free education. And,
yes, exactly. And if I hadn't been up at the local hospital recently being taken care of. Yeah.
I feel as though it's funny. This has come up a few times on here. And, obviously I feel like sometimes what we do brushes up against like politics and current events and stuff.
Yes.
But I tend to take this professional kind of neutral ground that isn't really consistent with how I have all sorts of opinions. I just don't necessarily bring them into work. However, I feel as though we're living in times where certain viewpoints are almost synonymous with someone being a bad person. And certain projects have become easier and easier to turn down for that very reason.
For sure. And I think that also comes down, I have a client who calls this consultative sincerity, that like you have to be willing to say the hard thing to your client, right? Or the person who's going to be potentially your client. I'm not saying that you have to be best friends with your clients. It doesn't really even matter if you like them, as long as you respect them and that you're aligned on what you're trying to achieve, right? Like, I think a little bit of healthy disagreement is perfectly fine. Can you maintain your integrity, your self-respect, and your pride in your work by how you interact with this person? And if their views or their attitudes are going to compromise those for yourself, I think that's always something to walk away from.
That's, well said. And I love that consultative sincerity.
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah, and there are classic stories out there of people where their criteria for picking a ghostwriter was some kind of a common ground politically or religiously or whatever, and it blew up because they didn't end up getting the book they wanted from the person who they thought was gonna, and I remember a long time ago that was advice that I got, which is it isn't necessarily what someone's views are, it's like how intrusive they are about insisting that like yours are identical to theirs. Like that's the red flag, not where they fall on the spectrum.
Yeah, I think like if they're insisting like, no, you have to write this specific thing and you really disagree with that thing, then that's where problems arise. So I think one thing, I don't go out of my way to disagree with people before we start working together, but it does give me a little bit of extra information if there's somewhere for me to push back on them a little bit, or to ask them a difficult question and see how they respond. Or because there are going to be times that you need to say, I disagree with what you said. Or the
Mm.
way you're saying that is going to blow up in your face. There's a memoir I'm working on at the moment, had a whole, like nearly a whole chapter that was like revisionist history of some pretty well-known stuff. And I was like, we can't write it like this. Like people will completely, this will completely undermine your credibility. Like, I know you like this version of this story, but that's not what happened. So, you've got to be able to have those conversations. And if it comes out of the blue to the client that you're willing to be disagreeable or that you're willing to push them, it's not good to be halfway through the project before they realize that you're going to do that. So yeah, it's good to have, just clarity about how you're going to manage that relationship early on.
I really like that. I'm going to start thinking about how to do that. I already, like, I know some of the questions I ask when I screen a project or set up a discovery call. I try to ask some where I'm getting a sense of like, I'm giving the person an opportunity to be really unreasonable if that's where
Yeah,
they're coming from, because I'd rather find that out on a discovery call
yeah,
than month 7 of a year-long commitment.
totally.
Just kind of wrapping up here, what kind of projects are you what are you working on now, and what kind of projects are you looking for in the new year?
So right now, as I said, I'm working on editing a memoir. She is a very, very, very accomplished woman who sort of the whole Ivy League background and kind of then put it all to one side and moved to Italy to become a wine writer, and just completely fascinating trajectory. So
Cool.
that's been really interesting. I'm really enjoying that memoir format at the moment. I work a lot with people who run their own businesses. So I've got another client who runs an executive search firm. They're placing C-suite leaders in some of the biggest companies in the US. So, he's got this whole view on leadership and what makes great cultures and all that kind of thing. So that's really interesting. But some of the best projects have also been with, individual consultants and coaches who just have a real driving passion to change an industry or to help a particular person within an industry. Lots of people who are working at kind of that executive level and want to either make a big change in that industry, see lots of opportunities for where things could be better, or who are kind of a bit later in their career and kind of want their book to become a legacy of everything that they've learned and taught and crystallized. So yeah, love the business field. I'm very industry agnostic. I'm very happy jumping across different industries there, but kind of those drives to create change and to leave a legacy are definitely my favorite projects.
Brilliant. That sounds like a really cool one, the wine writer. I'll definitely follow up, and I'll have to find out when that's out.
Yeah.
And then the question I love to end on is there anything else you wanted to talk about that we didn't get into?
Oh gosh, I feel like we had a very wide ranging conversation today. Yeah, I think ultimately, one thing that we talked a lot about traditional publishing. I think self-publishing still has a slightly less polished reputation, I suppose. But I think it's one of the best things that's happened to the industry in the history of the industry because it's democratized access to publishing, where previously it was very ivory tower. It was very dependent on who you know and where you went to school and did you have the right credentials. And now anyone can get in there. I think we're definitely probably at a bit of a crossroads with AI content, and that's a whole conversation for another day. The opportunity right now is still so high, right? To even if you start in self-publishing and you kind of get a track record, it's very easy now to leverage that into traditional publishing because it's easy to show that you're a safe bet. If you've sold 5,000 of your own books off your own effort, then a publisher is going to take that seriously. So I think there's still so much opportunity in this space, and there's so much change happening in this space at the moment that there's still so much that you can do, whether you're a ghostwriter, whether you're writing your own stuff. Yeah, it's just a really exciting time to be in the industry, I think.
Brilliant. Well, let's I'm really optimistic for 2026, at least for our corner of the business world.
Yeah.
I can't say the same about like the world generally. No, I think that's no, that's a great note to end on. And I think, and again, that's another thing. I mean, to your point about working with a ghostwriter or a book coach or an editor, it's navigating all of those questions. If anyone at home listening to this has heard a bunch of terms you haven't heard before, or this is like the first time someone has, there was something you said earlier about knowing like deeply how Ingram Spark works. Sometimes when I'm on a call with someone who's really blasé about like, oh, I'll just throw it up on Amazon, and I like to that's when I start talking about ISBN numbers.
Yeah.
And I'm like, cool. Did you do what is it, the 1 for 125 or 10 for 250?
Yeah.
And that tends to have
Slows it down a bit.
Slows it down a bit, because it's like, well, wait a minute. That sounds important and I have no idea what it means.
Yeah. There are just so many steps.
I honestly, I don't know how. So now, is that something you offer? Do you do like a full self-publishing?
Yeah. So my goal with every
package?
client, whether they're traditionally published or self-published, is that the book is either on sale and going out the door if it's self-published, or it's with the publisher, or at least the agent. So yeah, that's the goal, is to always kind of have it over the line that like, I literally cannot take you any further than this. I want the book preferably to be on sale. So that's always the goal. Yeah. So
Cool.
I think it's a bit unfair to leave them halfway to the finish line. But yeah, we talk a lot. I don't do marketing implementation, but I also do a lot of marketing strategy. So I'll sort of say, okay, let's have a marketing call at the start of the project. Let's map out all the milestones, all of the stuff that you and your team need to do along the way. And I will check in on you to make sure that you're doing them. But yeah, kind of helping them think through the marketing alongside the rest of the project as well.
Well, I will definitely, I mean, it sounds like, and this is one reason I've gotten in the habit of asking people about the full scope of what they do, is, I mean, that sounds like something where I'm always desperate for where to refer people for that kind of consulting and stuff. So yeah, because I've learned the hard way that it can be a pretty cold shower to just have your manuscript finished and then now what?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, always happy to talk about those ideas.
Laura, thanks so much for coming on. Where can people find you if they want to work with you and see what you've done?
Yeah, so my website is lauraiswriting.com, or I'm also on LinkedIn, and that's just linkedin.com/in/Laura-Gale. And yeah, I would love to connect with you. Please do reach out. I would be very happy to talk about your book.
Thanks again, Laura.
Thank you so much.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Laura's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.